So as Pat mentioned yesterday, excuse me, there are 4 Brahma-viharas, or heavenly abodes, compassion being one, the others being loving kindness, equanimity, and sympathetic joy. He defined compassion as a quivering of the heart when met with suffering or someone else's suffering or one's own suffering. Each of the Brahma-viharas has a near enemy, meaning something very similar, and a far enemy. The near enemy of compassion is pity. But pity implies looking down on someone or feeling above them, so that there's separation implied when we pity someone. Whereas with compassion, we're really joining with their suffering. The far enemy of compassion is indifference. We just don't care. So that, just to put compassion in some context. Kuan Yin, the statue to my right, as we said the other day, is the bodhisattva of compassion. She represents an open heart to all the suffering in the world and can serve as a model for our own heart opening. I think one of the ways which we open to compassion is through our own suffering. If we can cultivate some self-compassion with regard to our own suffering, it's a real opportunity to cultivate that heavenly abode. When we touch into compassion, we're touching into our innate goodness. We're recognizing what's already there. We're just allowing it an opportunity to express. But I believe we need to begin with compassion towards self, because without that, it's very difficult to cultivate it for someone else. We really need to begin cultivating self-compassion, touching into our own suffering, and then once we can feel the quivering of our heart with regard to our own suffering, we can then move on to the suffering of others. But it really is about our basic goodness. So we'll begin the guided heart practice by addressing self-compassion, and then we'll move through to others once we've worked with that for a while. So just begin by closing your eyes and bringing to mind some experience of suffering. It might be self-criticism. It might be physical pain. It might be loneliness or isolation. Just feel into that. Just feel into it in a way that you can experience it in this moment. Very often when we're suffering or filled with self-criticism or self-hatred, the heart closes. So the challenge is really to open the heart to our own suffering. And I think it's very difficult because we're so close to it. It's right in front of us. So one way to open our hearts to our own suffering is to imagine that you're standing in front of someone who loves you very deeply. And open to their compassion toward you, open to their love for you. Just imagine taking that in, taking in their care, their concern, their love, their compassion. And imagine that you can embrace their point of view, the compassion that they would direct at your suffering. And directing that compassion toward that suffering that you brought to mind. By accepting the compassion of the other person, can you feel your heart begin to open? Experience the heart opening toward yourself, toward those parts of yourself which cause you to suffer. But for the moment, just focusing on the one thing, the one form of suffering that you brought to mind. Just trying to see yourself as that other person sees you. Appreciating yourself as they appreciate you. And feeling compassion for yourself and those parts of yourself as they feel for you. Compassion practice necessarily has to be an active process. We have to actively engage it, actively open our heart to our own suffering. And imagining the compassion of another who cares deeply about you is one way to begin to open the heart toward your own suffering. I find it helpful when doing compassion practice to put one or both hands over my heart. And just imagining that you can feel the heart quiver. Feel the heart open. In response to your own suffering. Another way to cultivate self-compassion is to imagine yourself as a small child. And imagine yourself as a small child suffering because of something that's been done to you, or you've been yelled at or spanked, or your friend stole your toy, or whatever the reason. But we can imagine ourselves as that child, suffering, crying, upset, feeling alone. And allow the heart to open toward yourself as that child. Allow yourself to feel that compassion as the child would feel it. I like to begin compassion practice by addressing issues of self-compassion, cultivating compassion towards my suffering, and if that's difficult, using the experience of a loved one or the experience of yourself as a child to help open your heart. And then we next move to opening the heart to someone we care about, someone close to us, in their suffering. Feeling the quivering of the heart in response to their pain. And just bring that person to mind. Imagine their suffering. And letting the heart open to that suffering. Expressing compassion, letting them know they're not alone. And holding that compassionate space for them. And now opening our heart to the suffering of others in the larger sense. Might be the refugees in Europe. Might be people living in poverty, people living incarcerated. And here I think it's important just to tap into that larger sense of compassion only to the extent that we feel we can manage it, because it can be overwhelming. Pema Chodron talks about just dipping into it a little bit, just tasting it in manageable bites. But having an open heart toward those that we know to be suffering, and doing so in a manageable fashion. So as not to overwhelm ourselves. making compassion practice part of your regular practice, perhaps with gratitude practice or loving kindness practice, I think together they can really deepen our practice, open us up to others, reduce our sense of separation, allow us to feel into the commonality of all sentient beings. So we begin by touching into compassion for our own suffering. We rest with that. We work to cultivate that. Then we move to cultivating compassion for our loved ones, our friends, our family, members of our community who are suffering. We then broaden compassion, opening our heart in a larger sense to other suffering in the world. Always mindful that we need to just touch into it so as not to be overwhelmed. And finally, and I think most difficult, is cultivating compassion for those that we have a difficult relationship with, or who we feel are doing harm in the world or in the lives of others. But just trying to imagine the suffering that lies behind their misdeeds, or the harm that they're causing, knowing that they must suffer greatly to do such harm, and seeing if we can keep the heart open for the suffering of those with whom we have a difficult relationship, or about whom we have a difficult view, toward whom we have a difficult view. I think it's helpful when beginning to add a compassion practice to your regular practice to spend some time, maybe over weeks or months even, primarily focused on self-compassion. The transition from self-compassion, as we're able to cultivate it, to the other out-directed compassion is much, much easier, comes much more naturally. Often when we've cultivated or are cultivating self-compassion, as we open our heart to our own suffering, it really helps reduce it, puts it in perspective, takes the edge off. It's perhaps one of the most direct ways of addressing our own suffering. So work with any of the aspects of self-compassion and compassion toward others that we went over today and in the remaining time we have this afternoon for the guided meditation.